The clay of the northern foothills is unforgiving. It is a dense, red substance that clings to your boots like a bad reputation, weighing you down with every step, demanding that you earn every inch of movement. For Marcus Henderson, the clay was not just soil. It was an adversary that he greeted every morning at 4 a.m., long before the sun had crested the ridge of pines that bordered his property. If you had driven past the Henderson place in the autumn of 2022, you would have seen a sight that became the primary source of entertainment for the local coffee shop patrons 3 miles down the road. You would have seen a man, 52 years old, graying at the temples, standing chest deep in a trench that seemed to have no beginning and no end. He looked less like a farmer and more like a soldier engaged in a solitary trench war against the earth itself. The trench was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and it cut a jagged, ugly scar across the pristine pasture that his grandfather had cleared by hand 70 years prior. To the untrained eye, it looked like madness. To the neighbors, it looked like financial suicide. They parked their trucks on the shoulder of the county road. Watching him, it became a ritual. Yet Miller, whose family farmed the adjacent 300 acres of soy and corn, would lean against his rusted fence post, chewing on a toothpick, shaking his head with that specific brand of rural pity that borders on contempt. He would tell anyone who would listen that Marcus had finally cracked under the pressure. The farm had been struggling, everyone's farm was struggling, but Marcus was the only one reacting by tearing up his own grazing land. They said he was digging for gold. They said he was digging a bunker for the apocalypse. They laughed when the autumn rains came and turned his trench into a mud pit that swallowed his shovel whole. They laughed when they saw him slipping and sliding in the muck, covered head to toe in red slime, hauling buckets of water out of the hole by hand because he refused to rent a pump. They didn't know what he was building. They didn't see the notebook kept in the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, wrapped in 2 layers of plastic Ziploc bags to keep it dry. They didn't see the calculations. Marcus ignored them. He had to. The noise of their skepticism was nothing compared to the noise in his own head, the constant, humming anxiety of the electric meter spinning on the side of his barn. It was a small, glass-encased disc, but it wielded more power over his life than the weather or the market prices. The rates had hiked 30% in 2 years. The cooperative that held the monopoly on power in the county had sent a notice in July. Another surcharge was coming. A grid modernization fee. They called it. Marcus called it the end of his legacy. The dairy coolers, the milking machines, the heating lamps for the winter broods, everything required juice, and the juice was bleeding him dry. He had sat at his kitchen table one humid night in August, the bills spread out before him like a losing hand of poker. The hum of the refrigerator in the corner sounded like a taunt. He looked at the bottom line of the statement, for $180. That was just for the house and the small barn. The main operations pushed it over $1,000. He had a choices: sell off the lower 40 acres to the developers who were circling like vultures, waiting to turn his family's heritage into a subdivision of cookie-cutter houses, or find a way to unplug the farm from the system entirely. He chose the shovel. The idea hadn't come to him in a dream. It came from the creek. Whispering Creek was a deceptive name for the body of water that cut through the north woods of his property. It didn't whisper, it roared, especially in the spring melt. It was a fast-moving tributary fed by the high aquifers in the mountains, cold and relentless. For generations, the Hendersons had treated the creek as a boundary line, a place to water the cattle and nothing more. But Marcus began to look at it differently. He began to see it not as water, but as kinetic energy. He spent weeks walking the length of the stream, measuring tape in hand, ignoring the briars that tore at his jeans. He was looking for the drop. In the world of hydropower, water volume is only half the equation. The other half, the more important half, is the head, the vertical distance the water falls. Power is simply gravity acting on mass. The higher the drop, the more pressure you build. The more pressure, the more torque. Marcus found his spot near the old property line where the terrain dipped sharply into a ravine. He calculated a vertical drop of 40 feet over a run of 600 feet. He did the math on a napkin first, then checked it against the engineering formulas he found in library books he checked out from town. Flow rate times head height times gravity divided by efficiency. The numbers stared back at him. It was enough. It was enough to run the house. It was enough to run the barn. It was enough to run the welders and the shop, but only if he could harness it. And to harness it, he needed to divert the water from the high point of the creek, run it horizontally along the contour of the hill to maintain its elevation, and then drop it suddenly and violently through a penstock pipe into a turbine. He needed a canal, or rather, he needed a pipeline, buried deep enough to never freeze, flat enough to keep the water moving but not turbulent. The digging phase was a test of character that few modern men are asked to endure. He couldn't afford a backhoe. The rental fees for heavy machinery would have eaten the budget he had set aside for the turbine components. So he used the tools of his ancestors: a long-handled spade, a pickaxe, and a heavy iron digging bar. The trench needed to be 3 feet deep to get below the frost line. It needed to be 600 feet long. That meant moving roughly 5,400 cubic feet of earth, one shovelful at a time. The first week, his hands blistered so badly that he couldn't hold a coffee cup. By the third week, the blisters had turned to calluses as hard as oak. His back, initially screaming in agony, grew thick with new muscle. He fell into a trance state while he worked dig, lift, twist, throw. Dig, lift, twist, throw. He stopped thinking about the neighbors. He stopped thinking about the bill. He thought only of the grade. He had built a simple water level using a garden hose and glass jars to ensure the bottom of the trench maintained a perfect, subtle slope of 1 inch for every 10 feet. Too steep and the water would rush too fast, creating air pockets. Too flat and it would stagnate. It had to be perfect. It was during the second month of digging that the sheriff stopped by. He was a good man, Sheriff Davies, a friend of Marcus's late father, but he had a job to do. He leaned over the hood of his cruiser, watching Marcus emerge from the trench like a mole. "Got some calls," Marcus, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. "Folks are worried, saying you're digging traps, saying the land's getting unstable." Marcus wiped the sweat from his eyes with a muddy forearm. "It's irrigation, Sheriff, just moving water. Last I checked, a man has rights to the water on his own deed." The sheriff nodded slowly, looking at the pile of red earth that snaked through the trees. "That's a lot of work for a little water, son. You okay? I mean, really okay?" The implication was clear. They thought he was snapping. They thought the solitude and the debt had broken his mind. Marcus just smiled, a thin, tight smile. "I'm fine, Sheriff, just doing some renovations." He didn't tell them about the pipe. He had sourced it from a salvage yard 3 counties over. 600 feet of 4-inch Schedule 40 PVC. It was pressure-rated, durable, and most importantly, cheap because it was second-hand leftovers from a canceled commercial construction project. He hauled it back in his truck in 10-foot sections, 30 trips back and forth, driving at night to avoid questions. Laying the pipe was a surgical procedure performed with brute force. He had to glue the joints with a primer and cement that smelled of chemical death, working quickly before the adhesive set. Every connection had to be watertight. A single leak underground would erode the soil, collapse the trench, and ruin months of work. He pressure tested it with air, capping one end and pumping the other with a compressor. He walked the length of the line, listening for the hiss of failure. When he heard silence, he slept for the first time in days. Then came the backfill. Putting the dirt back in was easier than taking it out, but it carried a finality that terrified him. Once the pipe was covered, there was no fixing it. It was buried infrastructure. He tamped the soil down, packing it tight to prevent settling. By the time winter set in, the scar across the pasture was just a long strip of bare earth waiting for the spring grass to heal it. To the neighbors, it looked like he had just dug a hole and filled it back up. Yet Miller joked at the diner. Maybe he was looking for Hoffa, didn't find him, so he closed up shop. They laughed. They ordered their eggs and bacon and laughed at the crazy hermit on the hill. They didn't know that under the frost, a vein of potential energy was waiting to be tapped. Now came the heart of the beast, the turbine house. Marcus built it at the bottom of the ravine, a small, unassuming shed made of rough-sawn cedar. It looked like an outhouse or a tool shed blending into the tree line. But inside, it was a cathedral of mechanics. He poured a concrete slab, reinforced with rebar 3 feet thick. It had to be heavy. The force of the water coming down that pipe would be immense, and vibrations would destroy the machinery if the foundation wasn't solid. He bolted a steel manifold to the floor, a custom piece he had welded himself in the barn during the long winter nights. The manifold took the 4-inch water line and necked it down to 2 distinct nozzles. This was the result of his research. He wasn't building a water wheel. That was primitive technology. He was building a Pelton wheel. The Pelton wheel is a marvel of engineering efficiency. Instead of water pushing a paddle, a high-velocity jet of water strikes a series of cup-shaped buckets. The buckets are split in the middle, dividing the water stream in 2, reversing its direction almost 180 degrees. This change in momentum extracts nearly every ounce of energy from the water. Marcus couldn't afford a commercially made turbine. They cost upwards of $5,000, so he made one. He bought the spoons, literal stainless steel serving spoons, from a restaurant supply auction. He cut the handles off and welded the bowls onto a central steel hub he salvaged from an old truck transmission. It sounds absurd. It sounds like something a child would invent. But Marcus balanced it on a lathe until it spun with the smoothness of a gyroscope. He built the housing from a discarded propane tank, cut in half and hinged to contain the spray. The generator head itself was the most expensive part. He needed a permanent magnet alternator. A standard car alternator wouldn't work efficiently. They require high RPMs and waste power energizing their own coils. He needed something that produced power at lower speeds, something robust. He scraped together $1,200, selling his grandfather's antique shotgun collection, a painful sacrifice to buy a low RPM permanent magnet generator head designed for wind turbines. It was heavy, finicky, and beautiful. He coupled the turbine shaft to the generator shaft using a Lovejoy connector to absorb any misalignment. He wired it to a bank of rectifiers to convert the wild AC voltage coming off the generator into steady DC current, which would then be fed into a massive battery bank, and finally through an inverter to become the clean 120-volt AC that would power his home. The battery bank was the final piece of the puzzle. You cannot run a house directly off a generator. The load fluctuates too much. When the refrigerator kicks on, the spike would stall the turbine. You need a buffer. Marcus sourced 16 deep-cycle golf cart batteries. They were heavy lead-acid beasts. He wired them in series and parallel to create a massive 48-volt storage system. He built a vented box for them, lined with baking soda to neutralize any acid spills. The wiring was thick, all-gauge copper welding cable, wrestling it into place like wrestling a snake. He installed breakers, fuses, disconnects, and a grounding rod driven 8 feet into the rocky soil. He followed the National Electric Code better than most licensed contractors. He wasn't going to burn his house down after all this. Spring arrived with a vengeance. The snow roared down the mountains, swelling Whispering Creek until it breached its banks. The world turned green and wet. It was time. Marcus stood at the top of the hill at the intake. He had built a trash rack, a screen to filter out leaves and sticks, and a sluice gate to control the flow into the pipe. He looked down the hill. He couldn't see the turbine shed through the trees, but he knew it was there, waiting. He had spent 6 months for $1,000 and every ounce of his physical strength on this. If the math was wrong, if the pipe burst, if the turbine shattered, he was finished. He would have to sell the farm. He would be the failure the neighbors already thought he was. He gripped the wheel of the sluice gate. It was cold iron. He took a breath that tasted of damp earth and pine needles. He turned the wheel. Water rushed into the intake. It wasn't a roar. It was a deep, throat-clearing gurgle as the air was purged from 600 feet of pipe. He waited. It would take a minute for the water to reach the bottom and build pressure. He checked his watch. 30 seconds, 45. He began to walk down the hill, his boots slipping on the wet grass. He needed to be at the bottom to open the nozzle valves. As he descended, he heard it, a hiss, a sound like a jet engine idling. It was the sound of pressure building against the closed valves at the bottom. The pipe was holding. He entered the shed. It was cool and smelled of grease and concrete. The pressure gauge on the manifold read 18 psi. He waited. The water column was still filling. The needle climbed, 20, 25. It stopped at 17 psi. Wait, that was too low. He tapped the glass. It should be close to 18 or 19 based on the drop. He felt a spike of panic. Was there a leak? Had he miscalculated the elevation? Then he realized friction loss. The water was moving, filling the voids. He watched the needle creep up as the air bubbles compressed. It settled at 18.5 psi. Perfect. He reached for the first valve. This was the moment. He turned it slowly. A jet of water, invisible in its speed, shot out of the nozzle and struck the spoons of his homemade turbine. The sound was deafening. It wasn't a splash. It was a scream of physics. The turbine didn't just spin. It vanished into a blur. The housing vibrated. Marcus watched the voltage meter he had mounted on the wall. It jumped. 12 volts, 24, 40, 50. The turbine was screaming now, finding its harmonic balance. He opened the second valve. The pitch dropped slightly as the load increased, then stabilized. The alternator hummed a deep, powerful baritone beneath the soprano shriek of the water. He looked at the output display, 2,000 watts, continuous, 24 hours a day. Rain or shine, night or day. 2 kilowatts of power flowing into his battery bank. That was 48 kilowatt hours a day. The average American home uses 30. He was making more power than he could use. He flipped the main breaker to the house. In the kitchen, 300 yards away, the refrigerator hummed to life. The porch light flickered and then burned with a steady, unwavering brilliance. Marcus sat down on the concrete floor of the shed, listening to the water. He put his head in his hands. He wasn't crying, but his chest was heaving with a release of tension so profound it felt like a physical blow. He had done it. He had severed the cord. For the next few months, Marcus lived in a state of quiet victory. He didn't brag. He didn't invite the neighbors over to gloat. He simply stopped paying the electric bill. When the power company truck came out to disconnect him for non-payment, the technician was confused to find the meter already removed and the main service lines cut and capped at the pole. Marcus met him at the gate. "Don't need it anymore," Marcus said, handing the man the old meter in a cardboard box. "You can take this back to the office." The technician looked at the house, seeing the lights on, hearing the hum of the AC unit. "You got a generator running, buddy. Gas is gonna cost you more than the line power." Marcus just shook his head. "No gas, just gravity." The technician left, confused and likely thinking Marcus was stealing power somehow. But the summer of 2023 brought a heat wave that no one in the county was prepared for. It wasn't just hot, it was oppressive. Temperatures hovered at 105 degrees for 10 days straight. The air was stagnant, heavy with humidity. The grid, ancient and neglected, began to groan under the load. Everyone had their air conditioners running at maximum. The transformers on the poles buzzed like angry hornets. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in July, the sky turned a bruised purple. It wasn't a storm, it was a system failure. The heat had caused a major substation 3 towns over to blow. A cascade failure followed, one by one. The counties went dark. The hum of the countryside, the distant road noise, the tractors, the fans vanished. The silence was sudden and terrifying. At the Miller farm, Yep was in a panic. His ventilation fans in the poultry barns had stopped. Thousands of chickens were packed into long metal buildings that were rapidly turning into ovens. Without airflow, the birds would suffocate and die of heat stroke within hours. Yep ran to his backup diesel generator. He yanked the cord. It sputtered and died. He checked the tank, fuel sludge. He hadn't cycled the fuel in 2 years. He cursed, kicking the metal housing. He had 3,000 birds and maybe 2 hours before the die-off began. He called his neighbors. No answer. The cell towers were overloaded or running on dying batteries. He looked across the field to the Henderson place. The lights were on. Yep rubbed his eyes. It was dusk, and the Henderson farmhouse was glowing like a beacon. The yard light was on. He could hear the faint whir of a fan. He stood there for a long minute, his pride warring with his desperation. His chickens were dying. His livelihood was evaporating in the heat. He swallowed the bile in his throat, jumped into his truck, and drove up the long gravel driveway he had mocked for years. Marcus was on the porch, drinking a glass of iced tea. The ice cubes clinked a sound of impossible luxury in a blackout. He watched Jeb's truck skid to a halt. Yep jumped out, sweat soaking through his shirt, his eyes wide and panicked. Marcus, Yep gasped, out of breath. The power. It's out everywhere. The grid is down. I know, Marcus said calmly. Been out for 3 hours. How? Yep pointed at the porch light. How do you have power? You got a propane tank hidden somewhere. No propane, Marcus said, just the creek. The creek. What are you talking about? Yep wiped his face. Look, I don't care. I need help. My generator died. The injectors are clogged. My birds are gonna die. Marcus, I need juice. Can I run an extension cord just for the fans, please? Marcus looked at the man who had laughed at him. He looked at the man who had called him a lunatic for digging a ditch in the mud. He could have said no. He could have told Yep to get off his property. He could have pointed out the irony of the situation, but Marcus wasn't that kind of man. And he knew that in the country, you help your neighbor, even the ones who spit when you walk by. An extension cord won't reach. Yep, Marcus said, setting his tea down. And the voltage drop would be too high, but I got a portable battery bank charged up in the barn. And I got spare fuel filters for a Yanmar diesel, which is what I bet you're running. Bring your truck around to the shop. That night, the Henderson farm became the command center for the neighborhood. It wasn't just Yep. As the blackout stretched into day 2, then day 3, others came. They came for water because without electricity, their well pumps didn't work. Marcus had power, so his well pump worked. He ran a hose out to the county road and filled jugs, tanks, and buckets. He charged cell phones. He stored insulin for Mrs. Gable in his refrigerator. The folly in the ravine was silently, tirelessly churning out energy, oblivious to the chaos of the world above. People asked to see it. Marcus took a small group down to the shed. They stood in the cool dampness, listening to the scream of the water. They looked at the spinning spoon turbine, the scavenged propane tank housing, the car part hub. They didn't laugh. They stared with a mixture of awe and shame. Yet Miller ran his hand over the PVC pipe where it entered the manifold. You dug this? He asked softly. By hand? By hand, Marcus said, and it runs ... forever. As long as the creek flows and gravity works, Marcus replied. It's free. Yep. Once you build it, it's free. The validation wasn't in their words, it was in their eyes. They realized that while they were buying into a system that was fragile and expensive, Marcus had been building a fortress of independence. He hadn't been digging a hole, he had been digging a foundation. But the real test was yet to come. The blackout was just a prelude. The winter of 2024 brought the ice storm. They called it the glaze of the century. Rain fell at 30 degrees, freezing instantly upon contact with every surface. Trees snapped like matchsticks. Power lines collapsed under the weight of the ice. Miles of copper wire tangled on the ground. The roads were impassable. The county was cut off. No trucks, no repairs, no power. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees below zero. Houses without heat cool down fast. In 12 hours, you can see your breath in the living room. In 24 hours, the pipes burst. In 48 hours, the elderly and the infirm are in danger of hypothermia. The grid was destroyed. The power company said it would be weeks, maybe a month, before rural lines were restored. Marcus's system had one vulnerability: ice blocking the intake. He knew this. So, while his neighbors were huddling under blankets, Marcus was up at the creek. He had designed the intake with a bypass, allowing him to divert warmer water from the bottom of the pond back up to the screen to keep it from freezing. It was a closed-loop heating system for the water itself. He battled the elements, chipping away ice, adjusting the flow. His fingers were numb, his face stung by the wind, but he kept the water moving. The turbine kept spinning. The Henderson farmhouse became a sanctuary. He moved the furniture out of the living room and laid down mattresses. He had electric space heaters, usually inefficient and costly, but for him, they were fueled by the infinite energy of the creek. He hosted for families. They cooked on his electric range. They watched the local news on his television to see the disaster unfolding outside. The contrast was jarring. Outside, a frozen hellscape. Inside, warmth, light, and the smell of coffee. It was during those 2 weeks of isolation that the mocking stopped forever. It was replaced by a profound respect bordering on reverence. Marcus Henderson, the mudman, the crazy hermit, had saved them. He taught them a lesson that no amount of lecturing could convey. He showed them that true security doesn't come from a monthly subscription or a utility pole. It comes from understanding the land and using your hands to harness it. When the thaw finally came and the utility trucks began their slow crawl back into the valley, things didn't go back to normal. The neighbors changed, yet Miller came over one afternoon with a notebook of his own. "Marcus," he said, looking at the ground, "I got a wind ridge on the back of my property. Consistent 15 miles an hour, you think? You think you could show me how you wired that rectifier?" Marcus smiled. He opened the workshop door. "Come on in, yep, put the coffee on." This was the beginning of the legacy. It wasn't enough for Marcus to be the only one with power. He understood that a resilient community is safer than a resilient individual. If everyone had their own power, their own water, their own stability, then the next storm wouldn't be a crisis. It would just be weather. He began to teach. He held workshops in his barn on Saturday mornings. He taught them about Ohm's law, about fluid dynamics, about battery maintenance. He simplified the complex engineering into terms farmers understood. He compared voltage to water pressure and amperage to flow rate. He showed them how to scavenge parts, how to build stators, how to wind copper coils. The movement spread. It wasn't just hydro. The valley had diverse resources. The sun beat down on the southern slopes, perfect for solar. The wind howled through the gaps, perfect for wind turbines. Marcus helped the Johnsons design a solar thermal system to heat their greenhouse. He helped the Smiths build a methane digester to turn their cow manure into cooking gas. The Henderson Valley, as people started calling it, became a patchwork of innovation. It became a microgrid of independent nodes, loosely connected by friendship and mutual aid rather than copper wires. Universities started sending students to interview Marcus. They wanted to know about his sustainability model. They expected a radical environmentalist or a political activist. Instead, they found a quiet farmer with dirt under his fingernails who talked about common sense and the cost of debt. "It's not about saving the planet," Marcus would tell them, leaning back in his chair. "Though that's a nice side effect, it's about not being a slave to a meter. It's about looking at a creek and seeing freedom instead of just water." Years passed. Marcus grew older. The trench he had dug healed over completely, covered in lush fescue and wildflowers. You couldn't tell there was a pipe there, except for the faint sound of rushing water if you put your ear to the ground. The turbine shed grayed with age, covered in moss, looking like a natural part of the ravine, but inside, the machine kept spinning. The bearings were replaced, the brushes changed, but the heart of it, the spoon turbine, the scavenged generator, never stopped. It had produced megawatt-hours of power worth tens of thousands of dollars for the cost of some PVC pipe and a sore back. Marcus Henderson passed away in his sleep at the age of 82. The house was warm, the lights were on, the machine in the creek was humming. At his funeral, the entire county showed up. They didn't talk about his crops. They didn't talk about his cattle. They talked about the light. They talked about the winter of 2024. Yet Miller, now an old man himself, stood up to speak. He held up an old, battered piece of PVC pipe. Marcus dug a ditch, Yep said, his voice cracking. We laughed at him. We thought he was burying his life. But he was planting a seed. He showed us that we have everything we need right here under our feet if we're just brave enough to pick up a shovel and do the work. He didn't just give us power. He gave us our dignity back. After the funeral, Marcus's daughter, Sarah, went down to the turbine shed. She had inherited the farm. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air was still filled with that same smell of grease and ozone. The gauge read 18.5 psi. The voltage was steady at 120. She placed her hand on the housing of the generator. It was warm. It was alive. She thought about the millions of people in the cities, anxious about their bills, terrified of the storms, dependent on a system that didn't care about them. And then she looked at this spinning contraption of spoons and scrap metal. She realized that her father hadn't just built a generator. He had built a philosophy. A philosophy that said, the world will try to make you dependent, but you have the power to refuse. The elements, the wind, the sun, the water are not your enemies. They are your partners. You just have to listen to them. You have to be willing to get in the mud. Sarah closed the door, leaving the machine to its work in the darkness. She walked back up the hill, past the invisible line where the pipe lay buried. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. Down the road, she could see the lights of the Miller farm flickering on, powered by the wind turbine Marcus had helped design. Further down, the solar arrays of the Johnson place caught the last rays of the sun. The valley was alive. It was glowing. It was independent. And in the silence of the evening, if you listened closely, you could hear the creek. It wasn't whispering anymore. It was singing. To truly understand the victory of the light bulb in the Henderson farmhouse, we must strip away the romance of the finished product and descend into the purgatory of the process. The neighbors saw the trench and they saw the mud, but they did not see the internal architecture of the struggle. They did not see the nights where Marcus Henderson lay awake, staring at the water-stained ceiling, doing arithmetic in the dark that terrified him. This is the part of the story that the news cameras and the university students usually skip, but it is the only part that matters. It is the confrontation with the absurd. Albert Camus wrote that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Marcus was Sisyphus, but his boulder was 5,000 cubic feet of clay, and his mountain was an inverted slope leading down to a creek bed. The psychological toll of digging a 600-foot trench by hand cannot be overstated. It is a repetitive, mindless violence against the earth that reflects back on the psyche. In the second month, around mile marker 0.2, Marcus hit a layer of hard panclay so compressed by centuries of geological pressure that it acted like low-grade concrete. The pickaxe would bounce off it, sending shockwaves up his arms that rattled his teeth. Each blow removed perhaps a teacup of soil. He calculated his progress one evening, for inches an hour. At that rate, the project would take 3 years. He was hemorrhaging money. The farm's operating account was down to 3 digits. He had stopped buying meat. He was living on beans, rice, and the eggs from his own chickens. The system he was trying to escape was tightening its grip. The bank called twice a week about the overdraft. This is where the critique of the matrix becomes tangible. The system is designed to make the alternative seem impossible. It is designed to make the sheer caloric and mental expenditure of independence so high that compliance feels like relief. The neighbor's mockery was not just social pressure. It was the voice of the system defending itself. When Yet Miller laughed at the mud, he was really saying, come back to the grid. It's warm here. It's easy here. Just pay the fee. But Marcus understood something fundamental about the nature of comfort. It is a sedative. He realized that the pain in his shoulders and the blisters on his hands were not signs of failure. They were the sensation of the anesthesia wearing off. He was waking up. He began to treat the trench as a meditation. He stopped counting the feet remaining and focused entirely on the stroke, swing, impact, pry, lift. It became a rhythm, a mantra. He read Nietzsche during his lunch breaks, sitting on a bucket in the drizzle. He who has a why to live can bear almost anyhow. His why was the meter on the barn wall. Every time he felt like quitting, he walked up to the house and looked at that spinning disc. It was a parasite feeding on his labor. That anger fueled the pickaxe. The engineering challenges were equally crushing. The build phase was not a straight line, it was a series of catastrophic failures. The first major setback occurred when he attempted to cast the nozzle manifold. He had decided to use PVC for the high-pressure injection point to save money on steel. He built a complex mold and used high-schedule fittings. He glued it all together, let it cure for 48 hours, and then hooked it up to the test compressor. At 40 psi, the manifold exploded. It didn't just crack. It shattered, sending shards of sharp plastic flying across the workshop like shrapnel. One piece sliced his cheek open an inch below his eye. He stood there, blood dripping onto the concrete, surrounded by the wreckage of 2 weeks of work. Most men would have stopped there. The universe was clearly saying no, but the existentialist knows that the universe is silent and indifferent. It says neither yes nor no. It just is. The failure was not a judgment, it was data. Marcus cleaned the wound, swept the floor, and started over. This time, he used steel. He taught himself to weld better. His beads were ugly at first, like globbed chewing gum, but they held. He learned about penetration and heat management. He learned that you cannot rush the cooling process or the metal will warp. He was becoming a mechanic of necessity. The generator had the permanent magnet alternator PMA, was another beast entirely. The unit he had purchased was designed for wind, meaning it was wound for high voltage at low RPMs. This was good, but hydroturbines spin fast. If he let the turbine run away, over speed, without a load, the voltage could spike to over 300 volts, frying his charge controller and boiling his batteries. He needed a dump load. A dump load is a safety valve for electricity. When the batteries are full, the energy has to go somewhere, or the turbine will self-destruct. You cannot simply turn off a hydro turbine like a light switch. The water has momentum. If you slam a valve shut on moving water, you get a water hammer, a shockwave that can blow pipes apart underground. The water must flow and the power must be burned. Marcus scavenged the heating elements from 3 broken electric water heaters. He wired them into a steel tank filled with water. This was his dump load. When the batteries reached 54 volts, a relay would click, diverting the massive current into these heating elements. The water in the tank would boil, dissipating the energy as heat. It was a crude, brilliant solution. He was literally boiling water to keep his system from exploding. It was a closed loop of thermodynamic survival. But the true test of his philosophy came not from the machine, but from the regulatory body. In the spring of 2023, a county inspector showed up. He didn't come because of the trench, he came because the power company had flagged the property as suspiciously low usage. The system does not like outliers. If you stop consuming, you become a variable that needs to be solved. The inspector, a man named Henderson, no relation, just a cruel irony of common names, carried a clipboard and an attitude of bureaucratic boredom. "Mr. Henderson," the inspector said, standing in the driveway, "we have a report that you've bypassed the meter." "That's a felony." "I haven't bypassed anything," Marcus said calmly. "I've unplugged. The inspector blinked. "You mean you're without power?" "The house is condemned if it doesn't have a working sanitation and heating system." "That's code. I have power," Marcus said. "I make it. Solar." The inspector looked at the roof. "I don't see panels." "Hydro." The inspector laughed. It was a dry, paper-shuffling laugh. "Hydro. In this creek, you need permits, you need EPA clearance. You need a structural engineer's stamp on any dam exceeding 3 feet. No dam," Marcus corrected. "Run of river. I don't impede the flow. I borrow the weight of the water and give it back at the bottom. And as for the code ... Marcus walked into the house and came back with a binder. He had spent his nights memorizing the National Electric Code, specifically Article 690 and Article 705. He handed the binder to the inspector. Everything is bonded. Grounding rods are copper-clad steel, 8 feet deep, spaced 6 feet apart. The disconnects are visible and lockable. The wire gauge exceeds the amperage rating by 20% for safety. Inspected, the inspector spent 2 hours trying to find a violation. He checked the breaker panel. He checked the battery box ventilation. He checked the conduit burial depth. He was looking for a reason to shut it down because an independent man is a dangerous precedent. But Marcus had built it with the paranoia of the persecuted. He had over-engineered everything. Every wire was labeled. Every terminal was torqued to spec. Finally, the inspector stood by his truck, looking defeated. It's single quotes as ... compliant, he admitted, looking at the turbine shed. But just barely, one slip-up, one complaint about noise or water levels, and we pull the occupancy permit. You understand, I understand, Marcus said. You can go now. The encounter hardened him. He realized that he wasn't just building a power plant. He was building a sovereignty. The matrix wasn't just the electric bill. It was the assumption that you needed permission to exist. By taking control of his input's energy, water, heat, he was removing the handles that society used to steer him. Then came the crisis mentioned in the summary, but the summary did no justice to the visceral reality of the ice storm of 24. To understand the validation, you must feel the cold. It began on a Thursday with a deceptive calm. The temperature hovered at 33 degrees. The sky was a slate gray lid clamped tight over the valley. The rain started as a drizzle, but as it hit the ground, it didn't splash, it clicked. Supercooled rain. It remained liquid in the air but froze instantly upon impact. Within 3 hours, the world was encased in glass. The sound of an ice storm is distinct. It is the sound of tension. You hear the cracking of tree limbs, sounding like rifle shots, echoing through the woods. Marcus sat in his living room, monitoring his system voltage. The grid had died at 4 p.m. He watched the neighbors' lights wink out across the valley. First the Millers, then the Johnsons, then the street lights on the county road. The darkness rushed in like a physical tide. But in the Henderson house, the voltage held steady at 120 volts. The turbine was churning, however, the threat was escalating. Ice was accumulating on the transmission lines, not the grid's lines, but his lines. The 600-foot run of wire from the turbine shed to the house was strung overhead on wooden poles he had set himself. He hadn't buried that section because of the rocky terrain. Now, the ice was building up on the copper cables. Ice weighs 57 pounds per cubic foot. A half-inch of radial ice on a wire can add hundreds of pounds of load to the span. At 8 p.m., Marcus saw the lights flicker. He grabbed his coat and a heavy fiberglass pole he used for pruning. He stepped out into the nightmare. The ground was a skating rink. He couldn't walk. He had to slide, clinging to the fence posts. The wind was whipping ice pellets into his face, stinging like birdshot. He reached the first power pole. The wire was sagging, bowing dangerously low under the weight of the glaze. If it snapped, the house would go dark. The turbine would unload, overspeed, and possibly destroy itself before the dump load could catch it. He spent the next 4 hours fighting a war against gravity and ice. He walked the line, smashing the ice off the cables with the pole. Shattered glass rained down on him. His hands, even inside heavy gloves, were numb blocks of meat. He slipped and fell a dozen times, bruising his ribs, tearing his pants. But he kept the line clear. He was protecting his lifeline. At midnight, the temperature plunged. The rain turned to hard snow. This brought a new danger: slush in the intake. If the intake screen at the top of the creek clogged with slush Frazel ice, the water flow would stop, the pipe would drain. The turbine would spin dry, and the generator bearings would overheat without the cooling effect of the airflow generated by the spinning flywheel. Marcus had to go up the hill. The climb to the intake was usually a 10-minute walk. That night, it was a 40-minute crawl. The hill was a sheet of black ice. He had to use crampon spikes attached to his boots that he had bought years ago for a hunting trip. He clawed his way up the slope, his headlamp cutting a frantic beam through the swirling snow. When he reached the creek, the situation was critical. The intake was 70% blocked, the water level in the settling tank was dropping fast. He jumped into the freezing water. It was waist deep. The shock knocked the wind out of him, a cold so intense it felt like burning. He had to manually clear the slush from the trash rack. He used a rake, pulling heavy mats of ice and leaves away from the screen. He worked for 20 minutes in the freezing water, his body shaking so violently he could barely hold the tool. This was the price of independence. The grid customer pays with money. The free man pays with suffering. But as he cleared the last blockage and watched the water level rise, filling the pipe with a healthy, swirling vortex, he felt a rush of heat that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the heat of agency. He was alive. He was in control. He stumbled back down the hill, hypothermic but triumphant. He stripped off his wet clothes in the mudroom and stood in front of the electric heater in the kitchen. The red coils glowed. The heat washed over him. That heat was his. He had made it. He had wrestled it from the storm. The next morning revealed the devastation. The valley looked like a war zone. Ancient oaks were split down the middle. Power lines lay in tangled nests on the road. The silence was absolute, no traffic, no hum of the world, except for the Henderson place. Smoke curled from the chimney. He had a wood stove for backup, but didn't need it. The lights were on. This is when the neighbors arrived. The narrative in the first part mentioned them seeking shelter, but it didn't detail the psychological shift. When Yep Miller walked into Marcus's kitchen, he wasn't just cold. He was broken. The breakdown of the grid had broken his worldview. Yep was a man who believed in the system. He believed that if you paid your taxes and your bills, the lights stayed on. That was the contract. Now the contract was void. He saw Marcus, the man he had mocked, pouring hot coffee from an electric pot, and the cognitive dissonance nearly brought him to his knees. How? Yep asked, his voice trembling. How is this possible, Marcus? The radio says the main transmission towers are crumpled. They're saying 3 weeks. Physics doesn't care about transmission towers, Marcus said gently. Physics just cares about flow. Marcus didn't lecture them. He didn't say, "I told you so." That would have been petty, and Marcus had moved beyond pettiness. He simply put them to work. He needed help monitoring the battery bank. He needed help keeping the intake clear. He integrated them into the system. Yet Miller, the skeptic, found himself sitting in the turbine shed, watching the pressure gauge with the reverence of a monk watching a candle. He saw the needle hold steady. He heard the water. And for the first time in his life, he understood where energy came from. It wasn't magic. It wasn't a commodity. It was a relationship. The validation phase wasn't just about survival. It was about the death of the ego. The community had to kill their collective ego to survive. They had to admit that the crazy man was the only sane one among them. They brought their freezer's contents to Marcus's barn. He had empty freezers plugged in, waiting. Thousands of dollars of beef and pork were saved. They charged their devices. But more importantly, they charged their spirits. They gathered in the evenings in Marcus's living room. The storm raged outside, burying the world in white, but inside, they talked. They didn't talk about sports or politics, the distractions of the matrix. They talked about water tables. They talked about insulation, our values. They talked about seed saving. The crisis had stripped away the superficial layers of their interactions. They were no longer consumers, they were survivors planning their next move. Marcus introduced them to the concept of the refrain. He explained it one night while the wind howled against the windows. We look at the grid as a safety net, he told them, his voice low, but it's not. It's a leash. The longer the leash, the freer you feel, but you're still tied to the post. What we're doing here, he gestured to the glowing lamp, is cutting the leash. It's scary. You have to hunt for your own food. You have to make your own heat. but you can walk anywhere you want. This philosophical seed planted during the blizzard was more important than the electricity. It sparked the legacy that followed. The Henderson Valley microgrid didn't happen overnight. It started with mindset. After the power came back on, weeks later, most people went back to their normal lives. But not the ones who had sat in that kitchen. They had seen the alternative. They had tasted the autonomy, yet Miller was the first convert. He didn't just ask about the wind turbine, he became obsessed with efficiency. He realized that before you generate power, you must stop wasting it. He retrofitted his farmhouse, sealing leaks, adding insulation. He reduced his load by 40%. This is the deep psychology aspect of the change. It wasn't just about technology. It was about mindfulness. The system thrives on wastefulness because waste equals consumption. To be efficient is to be an act of rebellion. Marcus advised him on the wind turbine project. The wind mapping was crucial. They erected a temporary anemometer tower and logged data for 6 months. They found that the ridge behind Jeb's barn had a clean laminar airflow, undisturbed by the tree line. This was the build all over again, but this time it was a community effort. Marcus brought his welding gear, yet brought his tractor. The Johnsons brought lunch. They poured the foundation for the tower together. When they raised the tower, a 60-foot steel lattice structure, it felt like a barn raising from the 1800s. It was communal labor for communal gain. They weren't paying a contractor, they were building infrastructure. When the blades caught the wind and began to spin, feeding power into Jeb's new battery bank lithium iron phosphate this time, a technology upgrade Marcus encouraged, the cheer that went up was primal. It was the sound of a tribe reclaiming its fire. But the story doesn't end with success. It ends with the regrets of end of life that Marcus successfully avoided but saw in others. As he aged, he watched his peers in the town nursing homes, fading away in sterile rooms, staring at televisions they didn't control, eating food that came from a truck. They had played by the rules, they had relied on the system. And the system had warehoused them. Marcus stayed on the farm. His joints ached from the years of digging, but it was a good hurt. It was the pain of use, not the pain of decay. He walked to the creek every morning. He listened to the turbine. He tweaked the system. He added a solar array to the south pasture to create a hybrid system: solar for the summer when the creek was low, hydro for the winter and spring when the sun was weak but the water was high. It was a perfect symbiotic balance. He wrote in his journals extensively during these later years. These texts became the Bible for the local homesteaders. One entry, dated 3 years before his death, captured the essence of his journey. We are told that we are small and the world is big. We are told that the problems are too complex for us to solve. This is the great lie. The world is just physics and biology. If you understand how a seed grows and you understand how pulley works, you can build a civilization. I did not dig a trench to save money. I dug it to save my soul from the atrophy of convenience. When the end came for Marcus, it wasn't a tragedy, it was a completion. He had prepared his daughter, Sarah, not just to inherit the deed, but to inherit the knowledge. He had made her walk the line in the rain. He had made her rebuild the turbine bearings. She hated it as a teenager, wanting to be normal, to have a life that didn't involve grease and mud. But as she grew into a woman, she saw the hollowness of the normal world. She saw her friends drowning in debt, stressed by the rat race, disconnected from reality. She realized her father had given her a kingdom. The scene of his death was quiet. The house was humming with its own invisible lifeblood. He lay in his bed, the quilt pulled up. He asked Sarah to open the window. He wanted to hear the creak. "It's a good machine," he whispered. "Keep it greased." "I will, Dad," she promised. "Don't let them hook you back up," he said, his eyes fierce for a moment. "Promised me, don't let them put the meter back on." "Never," she said. He closed his eyes. The turbine in the ravine spun on, 70 feet below, capturing the gravity of the mountain and turning it into light for the man who had the courage to dig. But the story of the Henderson innovation did not stop with his heart. In fact, the true challenge to the legacy was just beginning. The system does not give up its subjects easily. 2 years after Marcus's death, the State Water Board introduced Resolution 402, a sweeping piece of legislation designed to protect waterways but effectively drafted by utility lobbyists to outlaw small-scale private hydro. They claimed it disrupted fish migration even though Marcus's creek had no migratory fish due to a natural waterfall downstream. They claimed it altered sediment transport. It was a power grab, pure and simple. Sarah Henderson received the cease and desist order in a certified envelope. It gave her 30 days to dismantle the illegal impoundment and diversion structure or face fines of $500 a day. The neighbors Yet Miller, the Johnsons, the Smiths urged her to fight. But how? They were farmers, not lawyers. The legal fees alone would bankrupt the farm, achieving exactly what the blackout couldn't. Sarah went to the turbine shed. She sat on the same concrete floor her father had poured. She looked at the spinning spoon wheel. She felt the vibration. She remembered his words, "The world is just physics. Law is not physics. Law is a construct. And constructs can be reframed." She didn't hire a lawyer. She hired a hydrologist and a videographer. She decided to use the tools of the modern age, the digital matrix, against itself. She created a video. It wasn't a rant. It was a tour. She showed the intake, proving it screened out debris but let aquatic life pass. She showed the water returning to the stream, oxygenated and cooler than when it entered, actually benefiting the ecosystem. She showed the meter, zero usage from the grid. She showed the bill, $0. She posted it online. She titled it, "Why the State Wants to Destroy My Father's Legacy." The algorithm, usually designed to distract, latched onto the authenticity of her plea. The video went viral. Not just local viral, global viral. Millions of views. People from all over the world saw the crazy trench, the spoon turbine, the red clay scar that had healed. They saw a woman defending her autonomy against a faceless bureaucracy. The comment section became a movement. Engineers weighed in, validating her setup. Environmentalists praised the zero carbon footprint. The pressure mounted on the water board. The governor's office got involved. The Henderson exemption became a talking point in the state capitol. They backed down. They had to. The optics of crushing a sustainable, female-led heritage farm were too toxic. They granted her a grandfathered variance, a legal shield that protected the system in perpetuity. Sarah had won, not with a shovel, but with the truth. She realized that her father's digging had been the hardware, but her fight was the software. Both were necessary. Today, the Henderson farm is more than a farm. It is a pilgrimage site for the appropriate technology movement. Sarah runs workshops teaching a new generation how to read the land. They come from the cities, burnt out and cynical. They leave with dirty hands and a spark in their eyes. They learn that the matrix is brittle. It relies on your participation. If you build your own infrastructure, you build your own reality. The neighbors, now a tight-knit cooperative of energy producers, have created a local intranet, a mesh network of Wi-Fi routers powered by their off-grid systems. They share weather data, crop yields, and technical advice. They have built a digital layer on top of the physical one, but this one they own. It is a closed loop of information, just as the creek is a closed loop of water. And deep in the ravine, the spoon turbine spins. It is spun for 200,000 hours. The stainless steel spoons are worn thin by the water, polished to a mirror finish. They will need to be replaced soon. Sarah has a box of new spoons in the workshop, waiting. She knows how to weld them. She knows how to balance the hub. She is not afraid of the maintenance. She knows that maintenance is the price of freedom. The neighbors no longer joke when they drive past the property. They slow down. They look at the house on the hill, always bright, always warm, a lighthouse in a sea of dependency. They know that down in the dark, in the wet earth, a machine is singing the song of the self-reliant man. And they know that if the world goes dark again, they know exactly where to go. The trench is gone, but the canal remains a vein of power flowing through the heart of the land. Marcus Henderson is dead, but the light is still on. And that, in the end, is the only immortality we can hope for, to build something that keeps the darkness at bay long after we are gone.